Imagine boarding a flight where silence carries more weight than turbulence. Picture a man in a simple gray suit, quiet and unassuming, stepping into first class. To most, he looks like just another passenger. To one flight attendant, however, he doesn't belong. What she doesn't know is that this man isn't just a traveler. He is the very force holding her airline's survival in his hands. One accusation, one act of prejudice, disguised as procedure, is all it takes to tip the balance. In the pressurized calm of 30,000 feet, a confrontation unfolds that will ripple far beyond the cabin walls. Before the aircraft even touches the runway, billions of dollars will vanish, an empire will crumble, and lives will change forever. How much power does a single decision carry? How fragile is respect when stripped away in front of strangers? And what happens when the quietest man on the plane chooses not to forgive? This is not just a story about arrogance. It's a story about consequences, dignity, and the hidden cost of prejudice. If this story stirs something in you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Now, let's step aboard Flight 709. The air inside Boston Logan International Airport shimmered with that peculiar tension only travelers know. Rolling suitcases rattled across tiled floors. Announcements echoed from ceiling speakers in clipped monotones, and the faint aroma of burnt coffee drifted from kiosks that never seemed to close. For most, this was noise irritating, mechanical, forgettable. For Dr. Marcus Ellison, it was background music, something he had long ago trained his mind to file away. He had spent his adult life moving through places like this: airports, boardrooms, conference centers, without letting the chaos touch him. His gift, and perhaps his curse, was an ability to retreat inward, to observe with sharp detachment while projecting calm. Marcus was dressed with a quiet precision that suggested thought rather than vanity. His charcoal gray suit had been tailored years ago by a craftsman in London, cut to fit his shoulders but without any flashy markers of wealth. His shoes were polished, but the polish was dulled by time, not freshly buffed to impress. The only clue to his true standing was a timepiece on his wrist, an understated vintage Patek Philippe, the kind of watch that whispered to those who understood and went unnoticed by everyone else. He chose it deliberately because Marcus believed that real power did not announce itself. It simply existed, steady and undeniable. He was not tall, not imposing, not the sort of man one would notice in a crowd. And yet, those who did notice often found themselves unsettled without knowing why. There was a gravity to him, a sense that he carried something enormous and unspoken. Marcus had cultivated that presence over years in boardrooms where words could move billions of dollars, and one misstep could destroy reputations overnight. He learned to sit quietly, to listen, to strike only when the time was right. Now, standing at Gate C-27 for transatlantic air flight 709 to Paris, he looked like nothing more than a weary academic on his way to a conference. The gate agent scanned his boarding pass with a polite but hurried smile. "Enjoy your flight, Dr. Ellison." Her tone was automatic, her hands already reaching for the next passenger. Marcus nodded, stepped onto the jet bridge, and felt the hum of the massive Airbus O-350 beneath his feet. The incline of the ramp, the recycled air, the muffled shuffle of boarding, all of it was ritual. He had done this so many times, the process no longer registered. What mattered was not the journey itself, but the silence it offered him. 7 hours in the air meant 7 hours of stillness, a chance to think, to plan, to prepare for the storm waiting on the ground. The first-class cabin glowed with soft ambient lighting. Cream-colored walls curved gracefully into private pods, each a small sanctuary with sliding doors, polished wood surfaces, and screens larger than most living room televisions. Marcus was in seat 2A, near the window, where he could look out at the night sky once the engines lifted them above the Atlantic. He stowed his leather briefcase in the overhead compartment, eased into the plush seat, and exhaled a long, slow breath. The seat itself was less like a chair and more like a cocoon. It wrapped around him, shielding him from the rest of the cabin. For Marcus, that privacy was invaluable. "Welcome aboard, sir," a soft voice interrupted. A young flight attendant stood at his side, her nervous smile sincere. Her name tag read, "Sophie Tran. Can I help you settle in?" Marcus returned the smile. "Thank you. Sophie, I'm in 2A. I'll be fine." His tone was warm, almost paternal. She nodded, relief flickering across her face, and moved on to the next passenger. Marcus appreciated her gentleness. He could tell, in a glance, that she was new. There was a certain eagerness in her gestures, a slight tremor in the way she held the champagne tray. He thought of his own daughter at that age, starting her first job, uncertain but eager to please. Sophie was collateral in a war she didn't even know was coming. Marcus opened his laptop, the familiar hum of the machine grounding him. He had work to do, emails to review, numbers to verify. Tomorrow in Paris, he was scheduled to sign off on a $4.8 billion financing package that would determine the future of transatlantic air. The airline was drowning, bleeding money from rising fuel costs and mismanagement. His firm, Ellison Capital Partners, was their last and only lifeline. Without his signature, the airline would collapse within the year. Every employee, from mechanics in hangars to gate agents in neon vests, was unknowingly tethered to his pen. He bore that weight silently. It was not the kind of power one flaunted. It was the kind one carried like a burden. He typed a few notes, the rhythmic clicking soothing. But behind his calm, a memory stirred. He remembered another plane, years ago, when a flight attendant had looked at him the same way Sophie had, but with suspicion instead of kindness. She had asked, "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" The words had been framed as procedure, but the meaning was clear. Marcus had smiled politely, shown his ticket, and buried the humiliation. He had told himself it wasn't worth the fight, but the sting lingered, sharp and unforgettable. Tonight, in seat 2A, he wondered if the ghosts of those moments ever really faded, or if they simply waited for the right time to reappear. Across the aisle, a man in a tailored navy suit adjusted his cufflinks and pulled out a newspaper. He looked like an attorney, Marcus thought, the type who lived in contracts and precedent, the kind of man who dismissed bias as an overreaction because he had never felt its sting. Marcus let his gaze drift away. He had no energy tonight for that brand of obliviousness. He wanted stillness, a quiet glass of whiskey, and the comfort of routine. As he leaned back, he closed his eyes briefly. He thought about the meeting ahead in Paris. The numbers were solid. The projections had been triple-checked. Transatlantic Air needed him more than he needed them. Still, he intended to finalize the deal. He wanted to believe in their potential, to believe that institutions could be saved when given the right resources and the right leadership. He wanted to believe in people. That belief, fragile as it was, kept him going. The boarding process dragged on. The cabin filled with the subtle choreography of wealth, expensive coats folded carefully, leather briefcases stowed, hushed phone calls about deals and deadlines. Marcus listened without listening, absorbing fragments of conversation the way one hears rain on a roof. None of it mattered to him. His thoughts returned to his daughter in graduate school, to his wife who always teased him for wearing the same gray suit too often, to the quiet dinner they planned in Paris once his work was finished. These were the threads of his real life, woven beneath the surface of the empire he managed. A shadow fell across him. He opened his eyes to see another flight attendant older, her uniform sharp, her posture rigid. Clara Hensley, the senior purser. She wore her authority like armor, and her smile did not reach her eyes. For a fleeting moment, Marcus sensed something familiar in her gaze, something he had seen before. The faint curl of suspicion, the quiet, corrosive question. Does he belong here? Marcus inclined his head politely, choosing not to react. He had learned long ago that power often revealed itself in silence. He returned to his laptop, but inside, a quiet unease stirred. He had come here seeking stillness, but the night was about to unravel. And so the flight began, not just across the Atlantic, but toward a storm no one in the cabin could yet imagine. The cabin door shut with a muted thud, sealing the passengers inside their floating world. The air inside the first-class section was different from the bustle of the terminal or the cramped rows of economy. Here, everything was designed to whisper calm, soft amber lights cast a glow against brushed metal trim, while the muted hum of the engine seemed more like white noise than thunder. Plush leather seats stretched out into private suites, with sliding partitions for those who wanted isolation. To the casual eye, it was luxury. To those who lived in it often, it was a place where glances, assumptions, and unspoken hierarchies played out as predictably as the safety demonstration. Marcus adjusted his seat, setting his laptop aside for the moment. He reached for the bottled water Sophie had offered earlier, nodding at her with quiet gratitude. The cabin was still filling, passengers trickling in one by one, each dragging behind them a faint aura of importance. These were people who lived in fast lanes and corner offices, who carried themselves as though time itself bowed to their schedules. Marcus had seen this theater many times. He usually sat through it unnoticed. But tonight, something told him the performance would not be so simple. From the galley, Clara Hensley emerged. Her posture was a study in control, chin slightly raised, shoulders squared, each movement deliberate. She had the air of someone who had memorized the choreography of command and rehearsed it for decades. At 47, she had spent more than half her life in these aisles. Her uniform was immaculate, her hair pulled back so tightly it seemed carved in place. She had cultivated a presence that brooked no challenge. To her, the first-class cabin was not merely a workspace, it was her dominion, a curated club she policed with vigilance. Clara had a reputation among crew members. To junior attendants like Sophie, she was both a mentor and a warning. She demanded perfection, but her version of perfection often came wrapped in condescension. Her colleagues whispered about her sharpness, her ability to turn minor irritations into disciplinary notes, her intolerance for anything she deemed unprofessional. But beneath all that, unspoken yet visible, was another truth Clara believed in categories. She believed certain passengers belonged in first class, and others did not. And though she would never say it aloud, the categories often aligned with the prejudices she carried quietly but firmly inside. She began her walk through the cabin, checking details with a practiced eye. Her smile for the businessman in seat 1A was warm, almost effusive. She leaned in slightly, her voice soft, making sure he felt acknowledged. For the couple in 3D and 3E, she offered a touch of small talk about their connecting flight to Rome. She had a gift for creating the illusion of intimacy, though the warmth rarely lasted once she turned her back. To her, these interactions were less about kindness and more about performance. They reaffirmed her belief that she was the guardian of this rarefied space, that she alone upheld its standards. When she reached Marcus in 2A, something in her expression shifted. She looked at him with the same smile she had given the others, but a trace of stiffness lingered at the edges. Her eyes flickered down his suit, his shoes, the laptop resting on the tray. On the surface, she was polite, but inside, a familiar alarm bell was ringing. In Clara's private world, Marcus did not fit the picture she carried in her mind of who belonged here. His skin, his quiet demeanor, his lack of ostentation. Something about him disturbed the order she so carefully guarded. Sophie, watching from the galley, noticed the shift too. She had been working with Clara long enough to read the subtle cues, the way her senior pursed her lips, the fractional narrowing of her eyes. Sophie's chest tightened. She hoped tonight would be different, that maybe Clara would let this passenger be. But already she could sense the tension forming, like a storm cloud on the horizon. Marcus, for his part, noticed everything. Years of experience in hostile boardrooms had taught him to see the smallest flickers of expression, to read intent before words ever formed. He recognized the look in Clara's eyes. He had seen it in banks, in hotels, in exclusive clubs. It was the look that said, quietly but clearly, you do not belong. He felt the old sting, the one he thought he had learned to bury. He sipped his water, keeping his face calm, but inside, a thought pressed at him. How many more times must I endure? This Clara moved on, but her mind was already circling back to Marcus. She told herself she was only being thorough, only ensuring that every detail in her cabin was correct. She told herself it was procedure, nothing more. But deep inside, she was already framing a narrative passengers like him often ended up in the wrong seats, or worse, tried to sneak into them. She had seen it before, or so she convinced herself. And she would not let her cabin be compromised by someone who didn't belong. Meanwhile, the other passengers settled in. Robert Fields, the lawyer in seat 2B, unfolded his newspaper with a crisp snap, glancing briefly at Marcus before retreating into headlines about markets and mergers. To Robert, Marcus was invisible, just another traveler. But Robert had an eye for drama. He would not admit it, but he thrived on conflict, on watching human tension unravel. Somewhere deep down, he hoped the quiet man beside him would become the center of tonight's story. Lawyers, after all, lived for cases, even when they weren't in court. Sophie busied herself pouring champagne, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Marcus. She had seen the way Clara looked at him, and she felt a pang of dread. Sophie was new enough to still believe in fairness, in treating every passenger the same. She couldn't understand why Clara singled people out, why her seniors seemed to enjoy flexing power over those least expecting it. Sophie wanted to say something, to remind Clara that boarding passes had already been checked, that Marcus had been nothing but courteous, but she also knew the risk. Speaking up against Clara could end her career before it began. So she poured the champagne, forced a smile, and prayed the night would pass quietly. The engines roared to life beneath them, a low vibration rising through the floor. The plane inched back from the gate, tugged by a lumbering tractor. Safety demonstrations played on the large screens, but few passengers watched. They were seasoned travelers. They had seen it all before. Marcus fastened his seatbelt, closed his eyes for a moment, and felt the subtle tremor of anticipation. He had work waiting in Paris, weighty work that would decide the fates of thousands. He needed calm, not conflict. He needed this flight to be uneventful. Yet something in Clara's gaze lingered in his mind. Like a warning he could not shake, Clara stood at the front of the cabin, her eyes sweeping across her domain. She saw order. She saw wealth contained, curated, controlled. And then she saw Marcus, even as the engines surged and the plane tilted skyward, lifting them into the dark. Clara's thoughts clung to him. She told herself it was nothing personal, just procedure. But already, beneath the surface, a decision was forming. She would not let this pass unchecked. For Marcus, the climb into the night sky brought a fleeting peace. He looked out the window at the receding lights of Boston, scattered like jewels along the black water. He wanted to believe this flight could be what it always was, a stretch of silence, a bridge between two demanding worlds. But in his gut, he knew the silence would not last. Something was coming, and when it did, the cost would not be measured in awkward glances or whispered doubts. It would be measured in billions. The aircraft leveled off above the Atlantic, the seatbelt sign chiming off with a muted ding. In the dimmed cabin light, a hush fell across first class. Passengers reclined their seats, ordered drinks, or slipped headphones on. The glow of screens flickered like scattered fireflies, each person settling into their private bubble. Yet beneath the cocoon of comfort, something unseen lingered, something only a few could feel. Marcus Ellison had pulled his laptop back onto the tray. Spreadsheets illuminated the screen, columns of figures that most people would have found incomprehensible. But for him, they were second nature. They weren't just numbers. They were lives. Every cell represented jobs, supply chains, families. His eyes moved steadily across the data, but his mind drifted. He could not forget the way Clara Hensley had looked at him earlier. It wasn't new. He had endured those looks his entire life. But here, in seat 2A, it carried a different sting. It wasn't only personal. It was symbolic. Tonight he carried the weight of a decision that could rescue or bury the airline she served. And the woman meant to represent its face had chosen suspicion over respect. Across the aisle, Robert Fields folded his newspaper and studied Marcus for a moment. He noticed the man's concentration, the way his fingers hovered over the keyboard with precision. Robert prided himself on reading people, and something about Marcus piqued his curiosity. He didn't look like the hedge fund types Robert often encountered on flights to Europe. He looked quieter, heavier in thought, as though the numbers on his screen carried more consequence than profit margins. Robert was tempted to strike up conversation, but instinct told him to wait. There was tension in the air, and Robert had learned to let tension ripen before stepping into it. At the front of the cabin, Clara moved with the calm authority of habit, yet her thoughts were far from calm. She had been replaying the moment at seat 2A again and again. Something about it didn't sit right with her. She told herself she was simply following procedure, ensuring no mistake slipped through. But beneath that rationalization was something sharper, something she refused to name. Marcus didn't fit the profile of her first-class passengers. She couldn't explain why that mattered so much to her, only that it did. In her mind, order in this cabin meant predictability. Marcus, with his quiet demeanor and understated suit, disrupted that order, and Clara disliked disruption. Sophie, meanwhile, lingered near the galley, pouring drinks with careful precision. She tried not to watch Clara, but she couldn't help it. She knew her senior well enough to sense where this was heading. The way Clara's gaze kept drifting back to 2A. The way her lips pressed into a thin line whenever Marcus stirred. Sophie felt her stomach tighten. She wanted to intervene, to find some subtle way to remind Clara that Marcus had every right to his seat. But she also knew the risks. A single act of defiance could end her probationary period in an instant, and Clara was not forgiving. So Sophie stayed quiet, though her silence weighed on her like a stone. Marcus shifted in his seat. He took a slow sip from his water glass, savoring the coolness, then set it back on the table. He tried to return his focus to the numbers, but his mind refused to settle. His thoughts circled around Clara's suspicion, probing it from different angles. Should he confront it? Ignore it? Would pushing back make things worse? These were questions he had asked himself countless times before, in hotels, in boardrooms, in restaurants. The calculus was always the same. Weigh dignity against disruption, pride against pragmatism. Tonight, however, the stakes felt higher. He was not merely Marcus Ellison, the man. He was Ellison Capital, a force large enough to dictate the future of the very airline he sat upon. To accept Clara's suspicions silently felt like betrayal, not only of himself, but of the truth he carried. He thought of his father, a postal worker who had endured slights daily, but always told Marcus to keep his head high, to move forward. Pick your battles, son, his father had said, but never forget the war. Marcus had lived by those words. He had chosen carefully which moments to resist and which to endure. Tonight, seated in 2A with the engines thrumming beneath him, he wondered which this would be. Clara approached again, her heels clicking softly against the carpet. She carried herself with the poise of command, but inside she felt the prickling certainty that something was amiss. She paused at Marcus's row, her smile polite but edged with steel. "Good evening, sir," she said, her tone a performance of formality. "May I see your boarding pass again?" Her words were calm, almost casual, but her eyes betrayed the suspicion beneath them. Marcus looked up from his screen slowly, deliberately. For a heartbeat, the cabin seemed to hold its breath. He had already shown his pass at the gate. Sophie had welcomed him. There was no reason for this request, no reason except the one she would never say aloud. He studied her face, the rigid lines around her mouth, the faint glint of challenge in her eyes. Then, without a word, he reached into his jacket, retrieved the boarding pass, and handed it to her. Clara took it, not with a light touch of courtesy, but with a firm grasp, as if seizing evidence. She studied it longer than necessary, her eyes scanning details she already knew would match. 2A, Marcus Ellison, Boston to Paris. Everything was in order. Yet she let the silence linger, letting the implication hang unspoken. This doesn't look right. Across the aisle, Robert lowered his newspaper. He had seen enough courtroom theatrics to recognize tension when it bloomed. His eyes flicked between Marcus and Clara, curiosity sharpening into fascination. This was no ordinary verification. This was accusation disguised as procedure. And Robert, though silent, was now an attentive witness. Sophie froze at the galley entrance. She felt her pulse quicken, her palms dampening. She wanted to step forward, to interject, but her voice stuck in her throat. She had seen this pattern before. Clara picking a target, cloaking bias in policy. Sophie hated it. Yet fear held her still, tethered by the fragile security of her new job. Marcus's voice finally broke the silence, measured and calm. "Everything is in order," he said softly. "My name is on the pass. My seat is 2A. What is the issue?" His tone carried no anger, only clarity, but beneath the clarity was steel, the kind that left no room for doubt. Clara tilted her head slightly, the faintest smirk at the corner of her lips. It's just that this seat is usually one of the last to be assigned. And you boarded rather early. Occasionally, there are discrepancies. I need to be certain. The words were professional. The subtext was poison. A man like you shouldn't be here. There must be some mistake. The air in the cabin thickened. A couple in row 3 glanced toward the exchange, whispering. Robert leaned forward slightly, his newspaper forgotten. Even the hum of the engine seemed sharper, as though amplifying the tension. Marcus closed his laptop with deliberate calm. He leaned back, his eyes locked on Clara's. Inside, he felt the old wound reopen, the same wound inflicted 100 times in 100 subtle ways. Yet tonight, the wound bled into something larger. He thought of the deal waiting in Paris, of the airline hanging on by a thread, of the employees who would rise tomorrow expecting their jobs to exist. And here, in this cabin, the very face of that airline was telling him he did not belong. A storm gathered within him, cold and precise. He had lived long enough to master his temper, to wield silence like a blade. Tonight, he felt the blade sharpen. This was not just about him. It was about the culture this airline represented, the arrogance it allowed to walk its aisles unchecked. And if Clara chose to push this further, she would learn what silence could do when it belonged to someone with power. Clara handed the boarding pass back with a clipped smile. "Thank you, sir. Just a matter of procedure." But in her mind, the procedure was far from finished. She would watch him. She would find certainty, and she would not be undermined in her own cabin. Marcus slid the pass back into his pocket, his expression unreadable, outwardly calm, inwardly resolute. The balance was shifting. He could feel it. And though the flight stretched long into the night, he knew the true turbulence had already begun. The hum of the engines had settled into a steady rhythm, a background lull that often lulled passengers into comfort. But in the first-class cabin of Flight 709, comfort was nowhere to be found. Tension crackled quietly, invisible but undeniable, like static building before a storm. Most of the passengers sensed it only dimly, a subtle tightness in the air. But for Marcus Ellison and for Clara Hensley standing in front of him, it was sharp as glass. Marcus reopened his laptop, trying to will himself back into the columns of numbers. Focus, he told himself. Focus on what matters. Paris. The contract. The company. Thousands of jobs. Yet even as the figures filled his screen, his mind would not settle. Clara's request, her gaze, the implication that he did not belong at gnawed at him, steady and corrosive. He had dealt with this too many times, in too many forms. Tonight, however, something inside him was shifting. Perhaps it was fatigue. Perhaps it was the sheer arrogance with which he had masked suspicion as procedure. Or perhaps it was the weight of what he carried, the knowledge that in less than 24 hours he was expected to save the very airline she represented. Whatever the reason, Marcus felt his usual reservoir of patience begin to run dry. Clara hovered near the galley, her thoughts simmering. She told herself she had handled the situation correctly. She had asked politely. She had followed procedure. Still, something about the man in 2A unsettled her. She tried to explain it to herself. His suit was too plain, his demeanor too reserved. He did not carry himself like her regular first-class passengers, those who broadcast their wealth through designer luggage and loud entitlement. He seemed different, and difference, to Clara, often meant danger. She could not let it go. The quiet authority in his tone, when he spoke to her, only fueled her irritation. Who was he to speak with such confidence? Who was he to look at her as though she were the one under scrutiny? Sophie Tran, standing by with a tray of champagne flutes, felt her stomach twist. She had seen Clara's fixation before. She had seen colleagues targeted for minor infractions, passengers embarrassed for trivial reasons. But tonight was different. Sophie felt it in the way Marcus sat, still but unyielding. He was not intimidated, not cowed. There was a force behind his calm, one that made Sophie both hopeful and afraid. Hopeful that Clara's prejudice might finally meet resistance, afraid of what might happen when it did. Minutes stretched into silence. Then Clara made her decision. She stepped back toward 2A, her smile gone, her voice clipped with authority. "Sir," she said firmly, "I am going to need you to come with me to the galley. We need to resolve this matter privately." Heads turned, conversations hushed. The man in 3C, halfway through a glass of Bordeaux, paused mid-sip. Robert Fields lowered his newspaper completely, now fully engaged. A murmur rippled through the cabin, the kind of murmur that arises when ordinary travelers realize they are witnessing something they will later recount. Marcus looked up slowly, his eyes locked onto Clara's, steady and unblinking. "No," he said softly. The single word cut through the air with more force than a shout. "We do not need to resolve anything. You have my boarding pass. You have my name. This is my seat. There is no issue." Clara stiffened. Authority was her weapon, and Marcus had just refused to yield to it. She raised her chin. "Sir, I am responsible for this cabin. I am asking you to step aside so we can clarify this situation. If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear." The phrase landed with the weight of accusation. If you have nothing to hide? The unspoken charge hung heavy. You must not belong here. Marcus felt the words slice through him. For a heartbeat, anger flared hot, threatening to break free. But he mastered it. He leaned back in his seat, folding his hands calmly on the table. When he spoke, his voice was low, precise, measured like the strike of a scalpel. "You have my documentation. You have my boarding pass. The gate agents have verified my seat. You are not seeking clarity. You are seeking confirmation of a suspicion you have already decided is true. And you are making a very grave mistake." Sophie gasped softly, unable to contain herself. Her hands trembled, the champagne on her tray quivering with her. She wanted to rush forward, to shield Marcus from Clara's scrutiny. But fear rooted her to the floor. She could only watch as the storm gathered. Clara's jaw tightened. She had not expected resistance, at least not like this. In her mind, innocent people complied. They didn't challenge. They didn't confront. Marcus's calm defiance felt like proof of his guilt. "Sir," she said sharply, "if you will not cooperate, I will have to escalate this matter further." Marcus tilted his head slightly, his gaze unwavering. "Escalate it, then. But know this, the problem you will create is far greater than you can imagine." The words fell heavy in the air, chilling in their certainty. Robert Fields felt a shiver run down his spine. He had argued cases in courtrooms that turned on a single phrase. And he recognized in Marcus's tone the weight of consequence, the quiet authority of someone who spoke not in threats but in promises. Robert's legal mind began connecting dots he could not yet fully articulate. Something was unfolding here that was far bigger than a boarding pass. Clara hesitated, but only for a moment. She turned sharply, her heels clicking against the aisle as she strode toward the cockpit. Passengers whispered in hushed tones. Sophie looked at Marcus, her eyes wide with apology she could not voice. Marcus did not move. He sat still, his calm now like the surface of deep water hiding powerful currents beneath. As Clara disappeared behind the curtain, Marcus felt a hollow ache open in his chest. He thought of the countless times he had chosen silence, chosen endurance. He thought of his daughter, who had once asked him why he'd let people treat him differently. He thought of the promise he had made to her, that one day he would not let it pass. And tonight, it seemed, that day had arrived. His mind flickered briefly to Paris, to the deal waiting. He knew, in that moment, that the course of events had shifted irreversibly. The decision was no longer only about balance sheets or contracts. It was about dignity, respect, and the consequences of their absence. In the galley, Clara's hand shook as she picked up the intercom. She told herself she was right. She told herself she was protecting the cabin, but somewhere deep inside, buried under layers of pride and prejudice, a flicker of doubt stirred. She silenced it quickly. Authority demanded certainty, and certainty demanded action. She radioed ahead for assistance. Back in the cabin, Marcus stared at the closed curtain, his expression calm, but his thoughts ablaze. The spark had been struck. The fire was coming. He could feel it in the silence of the passengers around him, in the fearful eyes of Sophie, in the lawyer's watchful gaze. He had not chosen this conflict, but he would not retreat from it. The price of retreat, he knew, was far greater than the price of confrontation. Outside, the Atlantic stretched endless and dark beneath them. Inside, in the carefully curated calm of first class, the fault line had opened. The spark that Clara had struck would not extinguish easily. It would burn. It would spread. And before the flight landed in Paris, it would consume far more than anyone in that cabin could yet comprehend. The curtain at the front of the cabin swayed faintly as Clara disappeared into the galley, her heels clicking out a rhythm of certainty. Behind her, the passengers of first class sat in an uneasy silence. It was the kind of silence that comes when people know they are witnessing something wrong, but no one is brave enough to stop it. The hum of the engines filled the void, steady and unchanging, a cruel reminder that while the plane soared calmly above the Atlantic, human dignity was being tested below. Marcus Ellison remained perfectly still in seat 2A. His laptop was closed, his hands folded neatly in his lap, his gaze fixed on the faint pattern in the seat divider. Outwardly, he was a portrait of composure. Inside, however, a storm churned. He had lived through moments like this before: the questioning stares at luxury hotels, the suspicious glances at exclusive restaurants, the assumption that he did not belong in the very spaces he had worked harder than anyone to enter. He had borne those humiliations silently, choosing his battles with the patience of a man who had built an empire from the ground up. But tonight felt different. Tonight, he was not only Marcus Ellison, the man; he was Ellison Capital, the silent force poised to determine the fate of the airline itself. And Clara Hensley had chosen to make him her target. The minutes stretched. Passengers exchanged whispers, their voices thin and nervous. Robert Field sat in 2B, leaning slightly forward, studying Marcus with the intensity of a man watching a courtroom drama unfold. He had practiced law long enough to know when the balance of power in a room had shifted, and he could feel it now. Clara thought she held control, but the man beside him radiated a quiet authority that Robert could not yet place. Whatever this was, Robert sensed it was more than a dispute over a boarding pass. The curtain snapped open. Clara returned, her face set in a mask of professional determination. Behind her trailed two uniformed officers from the airport's security unit. Their belts carried radios and batons, their expressions weary and resigned. They had been summoned into something they clearly did not want to touch. But Clara led them forward with the certainty of someone convinced of her righteousness. "Sir," Clara said, her voice pitched louder now so the entire cabin could hear, "you have refused to cooperate with a routine verification. I am requesting that you step out of your seat and come with these officers." The words cut through the cabin like a blade. Gas rippled. A woman in row 3 clutched her husband's arm. Robert Field shook his head slowly, a lawyer's disbelief flickering across his features. Sophie stood frozen near the galley, her tray trembling in her hands. She had prayed Claire would not escalate this far. Now that prayer lay shattered, Marcus did not move. He lifted his eyes to Clara, his gaze steady, calm, but unyielding. "You have my boarding pass," he said evenly. "You have my name. You know this is my seat. What you are asking is not procedure. It is humiliation, and I will not give you the satisfaction." Clara's lips thinned. "Then you are leaving me no choice." She gestured to the officers. They hesitated, uncomfortable. One of them, a younger man with tired eyes, spoke quietly. "Ma'am, we usually intervene only if the passenger is unruly or causing a disturbance. He seems calm to me." Clara's voice sharpened, slicing through the officer's doubt. "This is my cabin. He is refusing to comply. That is disturbance enough." The older officer shifted uncomfortably, but moved closer to Marcus's seat. Passengers leaned in, their curiosity mingled with unease. The cabin that had once been a sanctuary of whispered deals and clinking glasses was now a theater of confrontation. Marcus drew in a slow breath. His father's voice echoed in his memory. "Pick your battles, son." But this was not a battle he had chosen. It had been forced upon him, and if he yielded now, it would validate Clara's prejudice, not only to her but to every passenger watching. He could not allow that. Not tonight. He looked directly at the officers. "Gentlemen," he said softly, "you have no reason to remove me. You see me sitting here quietly, in the seat I purchased, disturbing no one. If you choose to act, you are not enforcing order. You are enforcing her prejudice." The younger officer's eyes flickered with recognition, with a hesitation born of conscience. He stepped back slightly, uncertain. The older one looked at Clara, then at Marcus, and finally at the floor. The silence stretched. Clara, feeling the authority slip from her grasp, snapped. "This is unacceptable. He is being hostile. He is challenging crew authority." It was Robert Fields who finally broke the tension. His voice carried across the aisle, cool and precise. "Excuse me, but I have been sitting here the entire time. This gentleman has not been hostile. He has been calm, respectful, and clear. If anyone is escalating this situation, it is not him." The cabin shifted. Murmurs rose louder now, emboldened by Robert's words. A man in 3A muttered. "This is ridiculous," a woman whispered. "She's targeting him." The quiet consensus of the cabin turned, and Clara felt it. She felt the gaze of her passengers, not with admiration, but with judgment. For the first time, her certainty wavered. Marcus leaned back, his eyes never leaving Clara's. His voice dropped lower, carrying the weight of finality. "You have 1 minute to return my boarding pass and leave me in peace. If you fail, the consequences will be beyond your comprehension." The words were not shouted. They were not theatrical, but they landed like a gavel striking oak, resonant and irreversible. The officers stepped back, unwilling to be pawns in a battle they now understood was bigger than them. Robert Fields nodded slightly, recognizing in Marcus the same authority he had seen in judges, CEOs, and world leaders, the kind of authority that required no uniform, no title, only conviction. Clara stood frozen, her face pale beneath the cabin lights. For a moment, she considered retreat, but pride would not let her. Pride and fear of losing control in front of her passengers. She lifted her chin, her voice trembling with anger she could not disguise. "Fine," she hissed, "but don't think this is over." She turned sharply, marching back toward the galley. The curtain swayed shut behind her, leaving behind a silence heavy with consequence. Marcus closed his eyes briefly. He had not raised his voice. He had not moved from his seat. Yet the entire cabin had felt the shift. He knew, as surely as he knew the engines beneath them carried them across the ocean, that the night had taken a turn. Clara believed she had shamed him. What she did not yet realize was that the shame belonged to her, and the cost of it would be far greater than she could imagine. Sophie set her tray down carefully and approached Marcus, her voice trembling. "Sir, Mr. Ellison, I'm so sorry. She gets like this sometimes. Is there anything I can bring you? Water, wine?" Marcus opened his eyes and looked at her. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with regret. He felt a wave of sympathy for the young attendant caught in a storm she had not created. "Thank you, Sophie," he said gently. "You've done nothing wrong. And no, I'm fine." She nodded quickly, her throat tight, and retreated to the galley. Her heart ached with guilt. She knew she had witnessed something unjust. And she knew, deep down, that the story of this flight would not end quietly. Marcus sat back in his seat, the quiet calm of his posture betraying nothing of the cold fury building inside him. The humiliation had been public, the accusation had been clear, and the judgment, though not yet spoken, was already forming. The curtain at the front of the cabin swayed faintly after Clara's retreat, its gentle movement belying the storm that had just unfolded. First class, usually a sanctuary of champagne and quiet indulgence, now felt charged with unease. Passengers shifted in their seats, whispering in tones that betrayed both curiosity and discomfort. Everyone knew they had just witnessed something ugly, but no one yet understood the scale of what was brewing. Marcus Ellison sat immovable in 2A. He had returned his gaze to the window, where a vast expanse of black ocean stretched endlessly below. Outwardly calm, inwardly he wrestled with emotions that pressed hard against the surface. He thought of his daughter's words again, her plea that he not let such moments pass unchallenged. He thought of the deal awaiting his signature in Paris, a deal that would save this airline from collapse. And he thought of the irony that the very face of that airline had chosen suspicion and humiliation over respect. The quiet fury in him solidified into something cold and absolute. Across the aisle, Robert Fields felt his pulse quicken. He had argued before federal judges, watched juries hang on his words, but never had he felt the same sense of imminent consequence he felt now. Something about the man in 2A radiated weight, a force Robert could not yet define, but instinctively respected. Clara had no idea. He thought she had provoked the wrong man, and she would learn soon enough, in the galley. Clara paced, her mind a battlefield of pride and insecurity. She told herself she had acted correctly, that order and authority demanded her intervention. Yet the murmurs of passengers, the hesitation of the officers, the lawyers' pointed words, each had chipped at her certainty. Her face still burned with humiliation. For 2 decades she had ruled this cabin without question. To lose control now, in front of a man who did not even look the part of her premium clientele, felt intolerable. She resolved that this was not over. She would not be undermined. If anything, she would escalate until her authority was vindicated. Sophie stood nearby, watching her senior with a heart full of dread. She wanted to speak, to plead with Clara to let it go, but she knew better. Clara thrived on defiance. Any resistance would only fuel her further. Sophie thought of Marcus, of his calm and quiet dignity, and felt guilt twist inside her. She had not spoken up. She had let the injustice play out. She wondered if silence made her complicit. Minutes later, Clara reemerged, her posture rigid, her expression unreadable. She strode down the aisle with the deliberateness of someone carrying a verdict. The passengers stiffened. Conversations hushed again. Robert folded his arms, bracing for what was to come. Marcus turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto hers with a stillness that carried more force than anger. "Sir," Clara said, her voice cold and loud enough for all to hear, "the captain has been informed. If you continue to resist crew instructions, you may be removed from this flight upon landing. Until then, you are to remain seated without further disturbance." The statement was both command and warning, delivered in a tone that suggested finality. But Marcus heard more than her words. He heard the fragile tremor of pride, the desperation of someone who knew she was losing control, but could not admit it. He let the silence stretch, allowing the weight of her declaration to hang in the air. Then he replied, his voice steady and low, but loud enough for those nearest to hear. "I have not disturbed anyone. Clara, you have. I will remain seated, as I have from the beginning. But do not mistake my calm for submission. You have crossed a line tonight, and the cost of that line will not be paid here in this cabin. It will be paid far beyond it." The words struck like a stone dropped into still water, rippling through the cabin. Robert felt his skin prickle. Passengers exchanged nervous glances. Even Sophie, standing near the galley, shivered at the quiet certainty in Marcus's tone. It was not bluster. It was not a threat. It was a promise. Clara flushed, her jaw tightening. "Your attitude is noted," she said curtly. Turning on her heel, she retreated toward the galley again, but the tension did not recede with her. If anything, it deepened, settling over the cabin like a storm cloud. Marcus leaned back in his seat, his eyes drifting once more to the window, but his mind was not on the darkness outside. His thoughts moved swiftly, calculating consequences with the precision that had built his empire. Clara's actions had not simply humiliated him personally. They had exposed something deeper, something systemic. If this was the culture of transatlantic air, what did it say about their integrity, their governance, their fitness for survival? He had come to this flight prepared to sign a rescue package. But now, he realized, perhaps rescue was not what this company deserved. Sophie approached timidly, her hands clasped in front of her. Her voice was soft, trembling with sincerity. "Mr. Ellison, I just want you to know I'm sorry. She shouldn't have treated you that way. Please, don't let her words weigh on you." Marcus turned to her, his expression softening. "Thank you. Sophie, I know it isn't your fault. You've been nothing but professional. Remember that." Her eyes glistened as she nodded. She wanted to say more, to apologize on behalf of the airline itself, but words failed her. She returned to the galley, her heart heavy with shame for what her uniform now represented. Robert Fields leaned slightly toward Marcus. His voice was low, conspiratorial. "Forgive my intrusion, but I've seen my share of disputes. I've never seen anyone handle themselves the way you just did. Most people would have lost their temper." Marcus studied him for a moment, then allowed a faint, humorless smile. "Losing your temper only validates the prejudice. Calm is a harder weapon. It cuts deeper." Robert nodded slowly, impressed. His lawyer's instincts screamed that this moment was bigger than any of them realized. The calm authority in Marcus's tone was not the voice of an ordinary man. It was the voice of someone who carried real power. Robert felt a chill of anticipation. Whatever was happening here, it was only the beginning. The cabin settled into a fragile stillness. Drinks were served again, though fewer passengers accepted them. The soft clink of glasses and the low murmur of conversations returned, but the air remained taut, like a wire stretched too thin. Everyone knew the night had changed. Clara had not won her battle. She had only deepened the divide. And Marcus, though outwardly calm, was already setting into motion consequences she could not yet fathom. High above the Atlantic, the engines roared steady and strong, but inside the cabin, the turbulence had already begun. The minutes after Clara's latest warning stretched long and heavy. The cabin lights had dimmed to a soft amber glow, but no one truly relaxed. Every passenger in first class carried the same thought in the back of their minds: something was wrong, and it was far from over. They sipped their wine a little slower, turned the volume on their screens a little higher, anything to pretend normalcy had returned. Yet beneath it all, tension lingered like a shadow no one could banish. Marcus Ellison sat motionless in 2A. His hands rested loosely on his knees, his breathing calm and measured. But inside, his resolve was hardening. Years of restraint, of choosing silence, of letting prejudice slide in the name of peace, had brought him to this moment. Clara had humiliated him in front of strangers, summoned officers to his seat, and still had the audacity to speak as though he were the problem. The cruelty of it was not new, but tonight it collided with a deeper truth. He was not just a passenger. He was the man whose decision could either save or doom the very airline she served. And he was starting to think that perhaps doom was deserved. In the cockpit, Captain Adrian Cole leaned back in his seat, scanning the blinking instruments with the casual assurance of a veteran pilot. He had been flying for 3 decades, crossing the Atlantic hundreds of times, and nothing about tonight's route struck him as unusual. Clear skies ahead, strong tailwinds, a smooth crossing. It should have been an easy night, but his gut told him otherwise. Clara had already sent 2 discreet reports through the interphone, describing a difficult passenger in 2A. Her tone had been sharp, even urgent, but something about it unsettled him. Adrian knew Clara well. She was competent, experienced, but also notoriously inflexible. When she disliked a passenger, she framed it as a safety issue, and more often than not, the passenger turned out to be guilty of nothing more than being inconvenient in her eyes. He glanced at his first officer, a younger pilot named Davis. "Keep us steady," Adrian said quietly, unbuckling his harness. "I'll be back in a few minutes." "You going to deal with Clara's report?" Davis asked, eyebrows raised. Adrian gave a grim nod. "I need to see for myself." He left the cockpit, stepping through the narrow passageway into the quiet luxury of first class. The contrast was always startling. Just a few feet separated the blinking lights and cramped space of the cockpit from this hushed lounge of wealth. Tonight, however, the lounge was anything but calm. The moment Adrian stepped through the curtain, he felt it. Passengers' eyes flickered toward him, some nervous, some expectant. He caught Robert Fields lowering his voice mid-whisper, Sophie stiffening at the galley, and, In the middle of it all, Clara standing with her arms crossed tightly at her chest, her expression brittle. Adrian moved down the aisle until he reached 2A. Marcus sat there, calm as stone, his eyes lifting to meet the captain's with a steadiness that unsettled Adrian more than any turbulence could. This was not the look of a guilty man. It was the look of someone wronged, someone waiting. "Good evening, sir," Adrian began, his tone measured, respectful. "I'm Captain Cole. I understand there's been some confusion regarding your seat." Marcus's voice was low, his words deliberate. "There is no confusion, Captain, only an accusation. Your purser has accused me of sitting in a seat that is not mine, despite the fact that my boarding pass, my documentation, and the gate agent have all confirmed it. She has escalated the matter, involving security, in front of your passengers. The confusion is hers, not mine." The captain turned toward Clara. Her face flushed, her lips pressed tight. "Clara," he said evenly, "may I see the passenger's boarding pass?" She retrieved it with visible reluctance, handing it over. Adrian examined it carefully. Seat 2A. Marcus Ellison, verified. Perfectly in order. He returned it to Marcus with a small nod. "Thank you, sir. Everything checks out." Marcus inclined his head slightly, as it always did. Clara bristled. "Captain, he was uncooperative. He refused to follow my instructions. That is a disturbance." Adrian fixed her with a level stare. "Sitting quietly in his assigned seat is not a disturbance. Calling security on a passenger who has done nothing wrong is, you have crossed a line." The words landed with the force of judgment. The passengers, who had been pretending to focus on their screens, now openly watched. Sophie's breath caught. For the first time, Clara's authority was crumbling in public view. Clara's face reddened. "I was following procedure," she said stiffly. Adrian's tone cooled, his voice dropping low enough that its edge cut sharper than a shout. "Procedure does not excuse prejudice. I will not tolerate my crew treating passengers with disrespect, especially in this cabin. Do I make myself clear?" The silence was deafening. Clara swallowed hard, then gave a curt nod. "Yes, Captain." "Good," Adrian said, his eyes never leaving hers. Then he turned back to Marcus. His tone softened. "Mr. Ellison, I want to personally apologize. You should not have been subjected to this. If there is anything I can do to make the rest of your flight more comfortable, please let me know." Marcus studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Thank you, Captain. Your professionalism is noted." The unspoken meaning lingered in the air, and it is the only thing I will remember positively from this flight. Adrian held his gaze a moment longer, sensing the weight behind the words. Then he straightened. "Enjoy your flight, sir." He gave Clara one last look, a look that left no doubt she was on thin ice, before returning to the cockpit. The curtain closed, but the cabin did not return to calm. The atmosphere had shifted irrevocably. Clara, pale and rigid, busied herself with meaningless tasks, refusing to make eye contact with anyone. Sophie avoided her completely, focusing instead on refilling glasses, her movements shaky but determined. The passengers, though silent, now looked at Marcus differently. Respect mingled with unease. They had witnessed not just a confrontation, but a moment of reckoning. Robert Fields leaned slightly toward Marcus, his voice a whisper meant only for him. "You handled that better than most men I've ever seen. I don't know who you are, but you're not ordinary." "Are you?" Marcus gave him a faint, enigmatic smile. "No one is ordinary, Robert. Not when you look closely enough. Robert blinked. Marcus had not just dismissed him. He had reminded him of something he had forgotten: the dignity every human being carried, whether the world recognized it or not. Clara returned to her duties, her face an unreadable mask. But inside, she seethed, humiliated in front of her passengers, rebuked by her captain, undermined by the calm defiance of a man she had tried to belittle. Her pride was shattered, and in her mind, it was not her fault. It was his, Marcus Ellison. She told herself she would finish this somehow. She told herself she had been wronged. But what she did not yet realize was that her battle was already lost, and the cost of it would be beyond imagination. Marcus reclined his seat slightly, closing his eyes. Though sleep was impossible, his mind raced, already drafting the email he would send once connected to the sluggish onboard Wi-Fi. Clara thought she had asserted her authority. What she had done was reveal the rot within her airline's culture, and Marcus Ellison was not a man who overlooked rot. He eradicated it. High above the Atlantic, the plane sailed smoothly through the night sky, but inside its quiet cabin, the balance of power had shifted. The captain had intervened. The passengers had witnessed the truth, and Marcus had made his decision. By the time they landed in Paris, the future of the airline would be rewritten forever. The captain's intervention had restored a fragile order to first class, but it was not true calm. Beneath the soft hum of engines and the glow of dimmed lights, a quiet awareness hung over the cabin. Everyone had seen what had unfolded. Everyone knew Clara had crossed a line, and that Marcus Ellison had faced humiliation with a kind of composure few could muster. And though outwardly the flight had settled, in reality it was only a pause. The real consequences had not yet begun. Marcus reclined his seat slightly, though sleep was impossible. His mind churned with the precision of a machine designed to calculate risk, consequence, and strategy. Years in finance had taught him how to separate emotion from judgment. Yet tonight, emotion could not be divorced from fact. What Clara had done was not simply rude. It was not merely a poor decision. It was a revelation. A revelation about the culture of transatlantic air. An airline on the verge of collapse had shown him exactly why it deserved collapse. He thought of the numbers waiting in his files, the billions earmarked for their rescue. He thought of the thousands of employees whose livelihoods hung in the balance. And then he thought of Clara Hensley, senior purser, face of the brand to its most valuable passengers. If prejudice could thrive at this level unchecked, what else was buried deeper inside? What else had gone unnoticed, ignored, or excused in the name of routine? Marcus opened his laptop once more. The faint glow of the screen illuminated his face, sharpening the lines of concentration. He scrolled through the spreadsheets, though he knew every figure by heart. $4.6 billion. That was the size of the deal, structured as a lifeline. Without it, transatlantic air would sink within the year. With it, they would breathe again. But Marcus now saw the deal through new eyes. To invest was not to save. It was to endorse, to legitimize. And Clara had shown him what the airline truly was. Across the aisle, Robert Fields watched discreetly. He had returned to pretending to skim a magazine, but his eyes often drifted to Marcus. He could see the man's posture, still as stone, his expression unreadable. And yet Robert sensed a storm behind the calm. He had seen men weigh verdicts in court, seen jurors decide the fate of lives, but never had he felt such gravity from a single passenger. Whoever Marcus Ellison was, Robert knew he was not just a man in a gray suit. Sophie Tran moved carefully down the aisle. refilling glasses, her steps quiet and deliberate. She avoided Clara, who had busied herself with mechanical tasks at the galley, her expression tight and rigid. Sophie's heart ached every time her eyes flickered toward Marcus. She wanted to apologize again, to say more, to explain that not everyone in uniform shared Clara's cruelty. But she also knew her words would mean little. What mattered now was what Marcus chose to do. Marcus connected to the onboard Wi-Fi, slow and temperamental as always. He drafted an email with the same precision he brought to billion-dollar contracts. His words were clipped, surgical, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Richard, terminate Aurora. Effective immediately. Irreconcilable differences in corporate culture. Catastrophic failure of governance observed at the highest customer-facing level. Public release by 0900 Paris time. He read the message twice, then a third time. Each word carried weight. Each phrase was deliberate. Terminate. Aurora was the code that would dismantle the deal. A deal that Clara, without ever realizing it, had placed in his hands and then shattered with her arrogance. His finger hovered over the send button. For a brief moment, doubt flickered. He thought of the mechanics in hangars, the flight attendants like Sophie who carried themselves with grace, the ground staff working long hours for modest pay. He thought of the families tied to paychecks from transatlantic air. They would suffer for the prejudice of one woman and for the blindness of the culture that allowed her to act with impunity. Was it fair? The weight of the decision pressed hard on him. He felt the familiar war inside, the clash between empathy and judgment. His daughter's face rose in his memory again. She had once asked him why he let people treat him differently, why he kept quiet when others mocked or doubted him. He had told her that power was not about raising your voice. It was about choosing when to act. And tonight, his choice had come. He pressed send. The message shot upward, bouncing from the aircraft's satellite antenna to a relay station, then across the ocean to a server in New York. From there, it would find Richard Hale, his most trusted lieutenant. Who knew better than to question an order of this kind? By morning, Aurora, the code name for the rescue deal, would be dead. Marcus closed the laptop slowly, as though closing a coffin lid. He poured himself a small measure of water and took a sip, letting the coldness steady him. It was done. The turning point had been reached. Not in a boardroom, not in a meeting with lawyers, but here, 30,000 feet above the Atlantic, in a cabin meant for quiet luxury. The fate of an airline had been rewritten by prejudice, arrogance, and silence. Robert Fields, still watching, noticed the faint click of the laptop closing, the subtle shift in Marcus's posture. He felt a chill, though he could not say why. He did not know what had just been set in motion, but he sensed it was something monumental, something irreversible. Sophie returned briefly, checking on passengers, her eyes catching Marcus's for the briefest moment. He gave her a small nod, a gesture of reassurance that calmed her more than any words could. She returned the gesture with a faint smile, though her heart was heavy. She could not shake the feeling that the story of this flight would not end quietly. In the galley, Clara seethed silently. The captain had humiliated her. The passengers had seen her authority undermined, and Marcus Ellison's calm defiance burned in her mind like a wound. She told herself she was the victim, that she had only done her job, that she had been treated unfairly. She refused to see her own prejudice. Instead, she nurtured her anger, blind to the catastrophe already unfolding far beyond her reach. Marcus leaned back, closing his eyes. For the first time that night, He allowed himself to feel the full weight of what he had done. It was not triumph. It was not satisfaction. It was gravity. The knowledge that his choice would ripple outward, touching lives far beyond this cabin. Yet he did not regret it. Sometimes the only way to correct a culture was to let it collapse under the weight of its own rot. The aircraft soared eastward, slicing through the darkness with mechanical certainty. But inside, one man's decision had already changed the trajectory of thousands. The turning point had passed, and by the time the wheels touched down in Paris, the world would know. The cabin of Flight 709 had settled into its nighttime rhythm. The lights were dimmed to a calming blue. Meal trays were cleared, and the quiet sounds of sleep began to ripple through the rows. Passengers tucked themselves into plush blankets or scrolled lazily through movies they would not finish. To the untrained eye, everything looked normal. But beneath that stillness, a silent earthquake had already begun. Marcus Ellison sat upright in his seat, eyes closed but mind fully awake. He felt the subtle vibration of the engines through the floor, the gentle pressure of altitude in his ears. To anyone watching, he might have looked like a man resting. In reality, he was listening to the quiet, to his own heartbeat, and to the echo of the decision he had just made. One message, just a few clipped sentences, had set into motion a chain of consequences so vast, even Clara Hensley, striding with false confidence in the galley, could not have imagined it. Far across the ocean in New York, Richard Hale had just finished gathering his papers when his secure phone buzzed. At first, he thought it would be a routine update, perhaps a legal clarification or a midnight call from one of their European banking partners. But when he saw the sender, everything else stopped. Marcus Ellison did not send messages casually. Not at this hour. Not with this level of encryption. Richard's chest tightened as he opened it. The words were few, but devastating. Terminate Aurora. Effective immediately. Irreconcilable differences in corporate culture. Catastrophic failure of governance. Public release by 0900. Paris time. Richard read it twice, then again, and felt the air leave his lungs. Aurora was not a minor project. Aurora was the code name for the $4.6 billion lifeline deal with Transatlantic Air. A deal months in the making, involving hundreds of lawyers, bankers, regulators, and advisors. A deal considered all but done, and Marcus had killed it with 4 sentences. Richard did not waste time with questions. 15 years of working with Marcus had taught him one thing when Marcus made a decision of this magnitude. It was final. No second guessing. No reversal. He immediately picked up his phone and dialed their general counsel. Wake up the team. We are terminating Aurora tonight. Draft the public release. SEC filing by morning. The other end sputtered with disbelief. But Richard's voice carried an urgency that silenced hesitation. Within minutes, the office that had been shutting down for the evening was alive again. Lights flickered on, phones buzzed, lawyers and analysts logged into secure calls. In the glass towers of Manhattan, the ripple had begun. Back on the plane. Robert Field stirred in his seat. He had tried to doze off, but his mind kept circling back to Marcus. The man had unsettled him in a way he could not quite explain. Robert was not a man easily impressed, yet he had seen something in Marcus's demeanor, in the precise calm of his words, that suggested power, real power, the kind that did not need to be declared. Robert replayed the confrontation in his head, the warning Marcus had given Clara. That the consequences would be beyond her imagination had sounded less like a threat and more like a prophecy. Robert shook his head, trying to dismiss it. But he could not escape the feeling that the prophecy was already being fulfilled. Sophie Tran moved quietly between aisles, collecting empty glasses. Her eyes flicked often to Marcus, who remained perfectly composed, as though untouched by what had happened. Yet she sensed the weight he carried, the decision behind his stillness. She did not know what he had done, but she knew instinctively that something had shifted far beyond their cabin. Sophie thought of her own job, her own place in this vast machine of an airline, and felt a ripple of unease. What if the injustice she had witnessed tonight was not an isolated moment, but a symptom of something much larger, thousands of feet below? The Atlantic stretched in endless darkness, yet the real darkness was descending in corporate boardrooms. By midnight in London, word began to leak through private channels. The rescue deal for transatlantic air was collapsing. Investors whispered through encrypted chats. Hedge fund managers alerted their analysts, and markets began to stir even in their slumber. The airline stock was not yet in free fall, but the tremors had started. At the Paris headquarters of a rival airline, an executive received a discreet message from a contact at a bank. The Lifeline deal was dead. His eyes widened. Opportunities like this came once in a decade. He immediately scheduled an early morning strategy call. Meanwhile, in a quiet house outside of London, David Lawton, the CEO of Transatlantic Air, was jolted awake by the insistent ringing of his phone. His CFO's voice cracked with panic on the other end. "David, it's over. Ellison Capital is pulled out. I just got the notice. They filed with the SEC. We're finished." David staggered out of bed, his heart racing. "That's impossible. We finalized the term sheet. He gave his word. They've withdrawn. The filing cites catastrophic failure of governance. David, this isn't about the numbers. It's about us. It's about the culture." David's mind reeled. He demanded answers, demanded a conference call, demanded to know what could have changed between yesterday and tonight. But the truth, though not yet spoken aloud in his boardroom, was already clear. One of their own had lit the match. Back on the aircraft, Clara carried herself stiffly, as though nothing had happened. She poured champagne with forced precision, greeted passengers with brittle courtesy. Yet every time she passed Marcus, her chest tightened. His calm, his silence, had unsettled her far more than she would ever admit. In her mind, she told herself she had been right, that she had done her job, that the captain and passengers had humiliated her unfairly. But somewhere deep inside, a flicker of unease whispered that perhaps she had miscalculated. Marcus, meanwhile, leaned back in his seat and stared at the ceiling. He had set the wheels in motion, but he felt no joy, only gravity. The shockwaves were spreading faster than even he anticipated. Soon, the markets would roar awake. Soon, Clara, her airline, and the world would feel the cost of prejudice. In the dimmed quiet of first class, passengers drifted in and out of uneasy sleep. Yet beneath the hush, invisible forces moved at lightning speed, reshaping destinies in boardrooms, stock exchanges, and homes. The cabin slept on, unaware that before they landed, the very airline carrying them would be brought to its knees. In the Paris-bound night sky, Flight 709 glided smoothly through the upper atmosphere, its wings cutting a steady path across the ocean. The cabin was hushed now, most passengers asleep or lost in the half-dream state that long flights invite. But Marcus Ellison remained wide awake, his mind sharp, his resolve immovable. He knew the message had landed by now. He knew Richard Hale and his team were working through the night, executing his order with precision. The deal was dead. The rest was only a matter of timing. On the other side of the world, the consequences were already unfolding. In a sleek glass tower in London's financial district, a private conference call was in chaos. David Lawton, CEO of Transatlantic Air, stood in his office, disheveled in a wrinkled shirt, his tie hanging loose. He looked nothing like the polished executive who just days ago had reassured journalists that his airline's future was secure. Around him, on a glowing wall of screens, were the faces of his leadership team, Gerald Price, the CFO, Marianne Walsh, the head of communications, 3 board members dialing in from their country estates, and a cluster of bankers from Goldman Sachs and J.P. Morgan, their voices tense and clipped. "They've filed already," Gerald said, his face pale. "The termination notice is public with the SEC. The press will have it in an hour. By the time the markets open, this stock is going to collapse." "This doesn't make sense," Marianne insisted, her voice rising. "We passed every audit, every compliance check. Their language is catastrophic governance failure. That isn't financial. That's cultural. That's perception." "Then fix the perception," David barked, slamming his hand on his desk. "Get me Maxwell on the phone. If this is personal, then we address it personally. He cannot walk away from this deal over optics." There was a silence. Finally, one of the bankers spoke carefully. "We've tried. His office is closed. Hale isn't taking calls. We've sent messages. Nothing." David's chest tightened. He rubbed his temples, forcing his mind to work past panic. Then he snapped at his chief of operations. "Where is he right now? We have his travel manifest." The young operations officer swallowed hard. "Sir, according to passenger logs, he is on board Flight 709, JFK to Paris. First class, Seat 2A. The silence deepened. Every executive on the call froze. "He's on our plane," Gerald whispered, his voice a mix of disbelief and dread. "He's sitting in first class while this happens." The pieces began to connect in David's mind with horrifying clarity. The timing, the phrasing of the termination notice, the reference to governance and culture. Something had happened on that flight, something involving Marcus Ellison himself, and Clara Hensley, his most senior purser, was in charge of that cabin. His stomach sank. "Get me the cockpit." "Now," David demanded. Within minutes, a secure uplink was routed to the aircraft. In the cockpit, Captain Adrian Cole was startled when the encrypted message printer beside him whirred to life. He tore off the sheet and scanned the words, his brow furrowing as he read the desperate plea. "To Captain Cole. This is CEO David Lawton. Confirmed, Doctor. Marcus Ellison is on board. If so, I beg you to personally deliver him a message. This is urgent. Tell him I am deeply sorry. Tell him I am on my way to Paris immediately to meet him. Tell him Hensley will be terminated before the aircraft touches the ground. Tell him anything he asks. We will provide. Please, Captain, persuade him to reconsider." Adrian felt a cold weight settle in his chest. So it was true. The man in 2A was not simply a wealthy traveler. He was the man holding the airline's survival in his hands, and Clara, blind in her arrogance, had attacked him. Adrian closed his eyes briefly, then rose from his seat. "I'll handle this," he told his first officer. He walked through the curtain into first class. The cabin was quiet, some passengers sleeping, others pretending to. But the moment they saw the captain, eyes opened, attention sharpened. Adrian moved down the aisle until he reached 2A. Marcus looked up from his seat, calm as ever. "Captain." Adrian held the folded message in his hand, his face solemn. "Mr. Ellison, I've received a communication from our CEO. He has been made aware of the events tonight, and he is horrified. He sends his deepest apologies and begs for your forgiveness. He has instructed me to tell you that the flight attendant responsible will be dismissed immediately. He is traveling to Paris to meet you personally and is prepared to offer anything you ask to repair this relationship. The cabin was silent, every waking passenger listening. Clara stood frozen near the galley, her face drained of color. Sophie's eyes darted from Marcus to the captain, her heart pounding. Marcus studied the captain for a long moment. Then he took the slip of paper from Adrian's hand, read it, and set it carefully on the tray table. His face remained unreadable. "Captain," he said softly, "decisions have already been made. Actions have already been taken. The time for apologies was before your purser called security, before she decided I did not belong in this seat. That time has passed." Adrian hesitated. "Mr. Ellison, the company is desperate. Thousands of jobs." Marcus lifted a hand, silencing him with calm authority. "Do not speak to me of jobs. Captain, I built my company on jobs, on lives, on responsibility. And I have learned that when culture rots at the top, it infects everything beneath it. Tonight I witnessed the rot firsthand, not in a balance sheet, but in the conduct of your senior staff. That is not something $4 billion can repair." The words carried the weight of judgment, final and unyielding. Adrian felt the futility of his mission sink into his bones. He had delivered the plea, and he had received the verdict. Marcus turned his gaze back to the window, the reflection of stars glimmering faintly in the glass. "Tell your CEO," he said, "that this airline had its word with me in New York. We have nothing further to discuss." Adrian stood there for a long moment, a messenger whose plea had been dismissed by a judge who had already passed sentence. Finally, he nodded. "Understood, sir." He walked back toward the cockpit, his shoulders heavy. The passengers shifted uneasily, some whispering, others staring at Clara, who remained rooted in place, her face a mask of disbelief. She still did not fully understand, but she knew enough to realize that something irreversible had happened. Her pride, her insistence, had just ignited a catastrophe. Marcus closed his eyes again, not to rest, but to anchor himself. He felt no triumph, no joy, only inevitability. The wheels of consequence were turning now, too vast for even him to stop. The desperate plea had come too late. The hours that followed were unlike any flight Marcus Ellison had ever taken. The aircraft moved smoothly through the night, engines humming their steady lullaby, but the atmosphere inside first class was thick and brittle. Even those who tried to sleep could not escape it. Conversations were hushed, movements restrained, as though every passenger knew instinctively that they were witnessing something extraordinary and terrible all at once. Clara Hensley walked the aisle stiffly, carrying out her duties with mechanical precision. She poured champagne, collected glasses, arranged linens, but every gesture betrayed the tension in her shoulders. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow. She knew the captain had spoken with Marcus. She knew her CEO had intervened through a desperate plea. Yet she clung to denial, telling herself it was all exaggerated, that surely one passenger's opinion could not undo an empire. Still, the whispers, the sidelong glances, the oppressive silence from her colleagues told a different story. Sophie avoided her entirely, her sympathy with Marcus so plain that Clara could feel it like a betrayal. Robert Fields sat upright, unable to relax. He had practiced law for decades, defended corporations and individuals alike, but never had he seen judgment delivered so quietly, so inexorably. The man in 2A had not raised his voice, had not issued a single threat. Yet Robert felt the truth as surely as if a gavel had struck. The airline's fate had been sealed in silence. As dawn approached and the faintest glow tinged the horizon, Marcus sat quietly, gazing through the oval window. His reflection stared back at him, calm and unreadable. Inside, however, he carried the weight of thousands of lives. He thought of the engineers, the mechanics, the flight attendants like Sophie, who worked with grace, and he wondered how many would now pay for the arrogance of one. It was not a decision he relished, but he believed it was necessary. A rotted culture could not be rescued by capital. It had to collapse so that something better could rise in its place. At 6:45 local time, the captain's voice filled the cabin, smooth and practiced. Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent into Paris, Charles de Gaulle. Please return to your seats and ensure all belongings are stowed. Cabin crew, prepare for landing. The words were ordinary, yet the atmosphere they fell upon was anything but. Passengers straightened in their seats, not with the usual mild relief of nearing their destination, but with a quiet sense that they were approaching something larger, something historic. Eyes drifted toward Marcus, whose calm presence seemed to radiate a gravity stronger than the engines pulling them earthward. Clara moved through the cabin for final checks, her voice brittle as she instructed passengers to fasten belts and stow trays. When she reached Marcus's row, she paused, her mouth opening slightly as though to speak, but no words came. His steady gaze met hers, and in that silent exchange, she felt the truth crash down. He knew. He had always known. And whatever power she had wielded in her small domain was nothing compared to the authority he carried effortlessly. She turned away, her knees weak, her throat tight. Sophie lingered near the galley, her heart pounding as the aircraft dropped through the cloud cover. She glanced often at Marcus, her admiration now mixed with awe. She wondered if she would ever see him again after this day, and if so, whether she would have the courage to thank him not only for his composure, but for the lesson he had forced into the open that respect is not a courtesy, but a foundation. The landing gear thudded into place. The cabin shuddered gently. Outside the window, the runway lights of Paris stretched like a glowing river beneath the gray morning sky. The massive aircraft kissed the tarmac with a soft bounce, then roared as reverse thrusters slowed its momentum. For a moment, all anyone could hear was the raw power of engines and the creak of metal under strain. Then silence returned, heavy and final. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Paris. Charles de Gaulle. For your safety, please remain seated until the seatbelt sign has been switched off, the captain's voice announced. The seatbelt light pinged, but no one moved. Not a single passenger reached for luggage or stood in the aisle. They all sat still, eyes trained on the front, waiting. It was not standard procedure that held them. It was the sense that history had stepped onto their flight and they were not yet free of its weight. Moments later, the cabin door opened. Instead of cheerful ground staff, 2 men in dark suits stepped inside. Their presence was subtle, but their posture carried unmistakable authority. They walked directly to Marcus's seat, their movements smooth and practiced, as though they had rehearsed this 100 times. One nodded politely to Marcus. He stood without hesitation, retrieved his slim leather briefcase, and followed them toward the exit. Passengers instinctively leaned aside, parting like water around a stone. Not one person spoke. Not one dared. At the door, Marcus paused briefly. He glanced back into the cabin, his eyes resting first on Sophie, who offered him the faintest nod, then on Robert, who stared back with unspoken respect. Finally, his gaze swept once across Clara. She shrank under it, her throat tightening as though she could not breathe. No words were exchanged, yet the silence was louder than any accusation. Then he turned and stepped onto the jet bridge, disappearing with the suited men into the airport beyond. The cabin remained frozen. Passengers sat stunned, their minds racing with what they had witnessed. Some would later tell friends and colleagues, embellishing the story with whispers of how a single passenger had toppled an empire. Others would never speak of it, afraid of sounding mad. But all of them carried the same truth they had seen power that night. Real power, exercised not with shouting or violence, but with calm certainty. Clara sank into the jump seat by the galley, her hands trembling. The weight of realization crashed down in full. She understood now that the man she had challenged was not just another passenger, not someone she could bully or dismiss. He was Marcus Ellison, the man whose name had been whispered in every aviation boardroom for months, the man whose capital was to save her airline, and she had tried to strip him of his dignity in front of strangers. She had not only humiliated herself, she had destroyed the company that employed her, the company her husband's career depended on, the company tens of thousands of families relied upon. Sophie stood nearby, silent. Her heart ached for Marcus, but also for the countless employees about to suffer the consequences of Clara's arrogance. She wanted to comfort her colleague, but she could not bring herself to move closer. Clara's downfall was of her own making. Robert Fields slowly closed the magazine he had not read a word of. He leaned back, exhaling, his mind already drafting the words he would later write about what he had seen. Tonight was not about contracts or law. Tonight was about humanity, about the cost of prejudice and the quiet strength of those who refused to yield to it. The engines powered down, and the heavy silence in the cabin deepened further. Passengers began to stir, some gathering belongings, some casting quick, uneasy glances at Clara. Yet the atmosphere remained subdued, as though no one wished to break the spell of what had just passed. Clara sat unmoving, staring at her hands. Her authority was gone. Her career was in ashes. And though she did not yet know the full magnitude of the damage, she felt it pressing in around her, suffocating and absolute. The flight had landed, but for transatlantic air, and for Clara Hensley, the descent had only just begun. The jet bridge at Charles de Gaulle was unusually quiet as Marcus Ellison walked away from the aircraft. The two men in dark suits flanked him seamlessly, their presence understated yet absolute. They carried no bags, offered no conversation. They were there only to ensure that the transition from aircraft to ground unfolded without interference. Marcus moved steadily, his slim leather briefcase in hand, his face calm and unreadable. Behind him, passengers began to stir from their shock, whispering in fragments, but he was already gone. For Marcus, the walk felt longer than it was. Each step carried with it the weight of the decision he had set into motion hours earlier. He knew by now Richard Hale had executed his orders. He knew the markets would be bracing for impact. Journalists drafting stories, competitors sharpening their knives. He also knew his name would not appear in the headlines. To the world, the reason for transatlantic air's collapse would be corporate governance failure. Not a single moment of prejudice, 30,000 feet above the ocean. And yet Marcus knew the truth. He had lived it. He carried it like a stone in his chest. Inside the aircraft, the atmosphere was brittle. Clara Hensley sat frozen in her jump seat, staring at her trembling hands. She could not process the silence that followed Marcus's departure. She could not process the passengers' glances, heavy with judgment and disdain. For years she had thought herself the guardian of first class, the arbiter of who belonged and who did not. Now she realized the enormity of her mistake. She had not defended the cabin. She had destroyed it. The captain's voice finally broke the tension. Cabin crew, disarm doors and cross-check. His tone was even, but beneath it lay exhaustion. Adrian Cole had tried to salvage what could not be salvaged. Now he could only deliver the aircraft safely to the ground. Knowing his airline survival was unraveling in boardrooms and headlines far beyond his control, Sophie Tran moved quietly, assisting passengers as they gathered their belongings. She avoided Clara's gaze, though pity stirred in her heart. Sophie understood that Clara's career was over, but what shook her more was the awareness of how fragile it all was. How a single act of arrogance could bring down not only one woman, but an entire company. She thought of Marcus as he had left the aircraft, calm and resolute, carrying a silence more powerful than any words. She would remember that image for the rest of her life. In London, the fallout erupted with brutal clarity. At 6 a.m, news alerts flashed across every financial wire. Transatlantic air rescue deal terminated. Catastrophic governance failure cited. Markets braced for collapse. Traders arrived at their desks to chaos. By opening bell, the airline's stock plunged in freefall. Hedge funds shorted aggressively. Competitors moved to capture market share. And analysts declared the airline's future effectively over. David Lawton, CEO of Transatlantic Air, stood in the boardroom as the numbers scrolled across a massive screen. He looked hollow, his skin gray under the fluorescent lights. The room buzzed with panic, voices rising, arguments colliding, but David barely heard them. His mind kept circling back to the passenger log. Seat 2A. Marcus Ellison, the man they had courted for months, the man who was supposed to save them, had instead condemned them. And he had done so after being humiliated on their own plane by his own senior purser. "Get her in here." David snapped suddenly, his voice raw with anger. "Hensley. Now." But Clara was not in the boardroom. She was in a small, windowless office at Charles de Gaulle, stripped of her badge and credentials, being escorted by airport security. The words suspension and termination echoed in her mind, but she could hardly absorb them. Her career was gone. But worse than that was the realization of what she had set in motion. She remembered Marcus's calm eyes, the captain's rebuke, the silence of passengers. She thought of her husband, Gary, who worked for an airline supplier dependent on transatlantic contracts. She thought of their son's tuition, their mortgage, their future. The walls seemed to close in, suffocating her. Hours later, Clara returned home to their modest suburban house. Gary was at the kitchen table, staring into an empty glass. Papers lay scattered across the surface. Memos from his company, Aeromex Solutions. He looked up, his face ashen. "It's over," he said flatly. Clara's throat tightened. "What do you mean?" "Our only contract was with Transatlantic. The deal fell apart overnight. They're filing bankruptcy. Aeromex is shutting down. I'm out of a job. Everyone is." Her knees nearly buckled. She gripped the counter for support. "Gary, I didn't know. I couldn't have known." He studied her, his eyes hollow with shock. "What happened?" "Clara, they're saying the investors cited governance, culture. That wasn't numbers. That wasn't balance sheets. That was human. Do you know what they meant?" Her lips parted, but no words came. How could she explain? How could she confess that her arrogance, her prejudice, her need to feel superior for a single moment in a cabin had set off the collapse of an empire? Tears burned in her eyes, but she swallowed them, her silence damning. Gary shook his head slowly, as though finally understanding. "My God, it was you." The words fell like a blade. Clara sank into a chair, her face buried in her hands. Her sobs filled the kitchen, but no comfort came. Her family, her company, her future, all of it had burned because she could not see past her own bias. Back in Paris, Marcus was driven in a black sedan through quiet morning streets. The city stirred awake, but he barely noticed. His eyes rested on the horizon, his thoughts on the storm he had unleashed. He felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only weariness. He had not sought vengeance. He had sought dignity. Yet in this world, dignity often demanded a price. Richard Hale's voice came through the secure phone on the seat beside him. "It's done. The release is everywhere. The market reaction is brutal. You've dismantled them." Marcus lifted the phone, his voice calm but heavy. "We didn't dismantle them, Richard. They dismantled themselves. We only refused to carry their weight." He ended the call, staring once more out the window at the awakening city. For years, he had believed change came through capital, through careful investment, through shaping companies from within. But tonight had reminded him of a truth he had always known. Sometimes the most powerful act of leadership is to walk away, to let what is rotten collapse. The car pulled up to a quiet townhouse in the 7th arrondissement. Marcus stepped out, briefcase in hand, shoulders steady. He knew the story of Flight 709 would ripple through whispers and rumors, that some would guess the truth, others would dismiss it. But the reality would remain between him and those who had witnessed it firsthand. He had not shouted. He had not raged. He had only chosen not to forgive. And that choice had grounded an empire. What began as a simple journey across the Atlantic became a lesson written in silence and consequence. A flight attendant's arrogance, born from prejudice, ignited a chain reaction that shattered an airline, destroyed livelihoods, and left her own life in ruins. And all because she failed to see the man before her for what he truly was, a human being worthy of respect. Marcus Ellison did not shout. He did not rage. He did not demand. He simply refused to accept humiliation. His quiet decision reminded the world that dignity is not negotiable, and that when respect is denied, the price can be catastrophic. Let this story linger with you. Let it remind us all that every action matters. Every word carries weight, and prejudice, even in a single moment, can ripple outward to devastate lives far beyond our sight. If this story touched you, share it. If it made you think, talk about it. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, like this video and subscribe to our channel. Together, we can keep these voices alive, challenge injustice, and remind the world of the power of respect.